Hey everyone, Simplistic Witch here, and today I'm going to be doing a video on my 5 favorite witchy podcasts. Now, all of these podcasts can be found on Apple devices if you have the podcast app, and some of them can also be found on SoundCloud. And if you're not able to find them on either of those two, you can do a Google search on it, but you'll be able to find them on Tumblr or something of the sorts. So, the first one I had to talk about is The Witch's View. Now, The Witch's View is about two people who talk about different magical practices, and they talk about their own experiences within that magical practice. And they also have people come on the show and they interview them, and they usually have a different type of magical practice or very similar ones, and they usually talk about things of that nature. And honestly, I really enjoy the fact that they talk about their own personal experience with things, because some people who do podcasts really like to keep their practice secretive and really like to keep it to themselves, and they're very open, they're very sure, they keep certain things, to themselves, but for the most part, they give you a lot of different ideas you can do within your own magical practice, and just different things of that nature that you can really run with it and make your own. And one of the guys that are on the show is also a musician, so he talks about a lot about his music and he also plays some of the music he makes also on the show. And he also talks about incorporating music into his practice. And now the second one I have to talk about is Beatrix in Between. I really like Beatrix in Between because these two women are very relatable. They're two mothers who are also witches, and they talk about household witchcraft and different things you can do within your household that are very very easy to do. They're very easy, and they also talk a lot about a lot of spirit work. I always hear them talk about spirit work, and something they also talk a lot about is gardening, as well as their personal lives with their families. They don't really give out the names or give any too specific of details about their personal lives, but they do dabble here and there about the things they do in their personal lives, and I'm pretty sure even one of their husbands was even interviewed in one of the episodes too. And he doesn't practice witchcraft or even a pagan, but it was very interesting to hear him, give his perspective on witchcraft and what his wife does. And they also have many more guests that come on the show and they do interviews with that aren't even witches or even pagans. I remember, I'm pretty sure they had women go on that show who was practice Hinduism or Buddhism, and that was a really interesting episode to listen to because they talked about the bindi, that Hindu women wear between the eyes to symbolize marriage, or if they become widowed, or if they the bindi can symbolize a lot of different things for a lot of different cultures. So they talk about a lot of different religions with the guests they have on that show. So that's something I've also really liked because it gives you different perspectives, and it also makes you just more worldly on other religions. And then the third one I have to talk about is the Fat Feminist Witch podcast. And she is obviously, the name pretty much speaks for itself, but she talks a lot about feminism in her podcast, and she also talks a lot about books too. She does a lot of interviews with the authors she talks about. So say if she is talking about a book and doing a review on it, she usually has the author of the book also with her to talk about why she made the book and just different things having to do with the book. So I really like that if you're somebody who's a big reader like I am, and you're always looking for a new book to get into or just something of that nature, this is a really good podcast to listen to if you always want a new book to listen to. And she also talks about different topics not having to do with paganism or witchcraft or anything of the nature. She talks about different, I'm pretty sure she dabbles on politics a little bit here and there, but she also talks about different world topics that are happening all around the world. So, if you're somebody who likes to keep up on the, news around the world, then she also dabbles on that a little bit here and there too. And then the fourth one I have to talk about is the PDX Witches Guild. I'm pretty sure is the name of it. Yeah, the PDX Witches Guild podcast. And this is a podcast that originated in the Tumblr community. And these are younger witches who talk about different practices and their perspectives on different magical practices. And I really like it because if you're somebody who's younger in the witch pagan community, then this is a great podcast to listen to because you get to hear people close to your age range talk about witchcraft. And I really like that because they always have tons of people on their podcast too. I'm pretty sure they always have like 4 people or more on the podcast. Like they have a large amount of people on the podcast, so it's always fun to, you know, and they're all very different. A lot of them are very different, so it's really refreshing to hear tons of different people talk about the practices, because, you know, some of them do little similar things here and there, but most of the part, you know, most of the time they're very different. You know, they're very different. They have different opinions on different things. And also keep in mind, this podcast is very new. I'm pretty sure they only have 3 episodes out. They just came out a couple months ago, so I don't have really too much to say about them. But that was a basic overview on that podcast. And also keep in mind, the next podcast I'm going to be talking about, the last one, is also a newer podcast that was in the Tumblr community. So I'm pretty sure they also only have 3 episodes out. So don't be expecting me to say too much about them, because I have only listened to 2 of the podcasts so far, but I really like their podcast. So this is why I added them to my list, because it's very different than the other ones I was just talking about. This one's called The Circle of Salt, and they talk about a lot of controversial topics within the witch and pagan community. So, you know, if you're looking for something that's very controversial and something that a lot of people don't really talk about, this podcast is really good, because they really don't sugarcoat anything, and they give their honest opinions about what the topic is that they talk about. And they also are big time tarot readers, and they love doing tarot and, you know, doing tarot readings for people that follow the podcast. So if you're also someone who is learning tarot or wants to know more about tarot, or how other people do tarot, and just, you know, tarot in general, then this podcast will also be good, because they do a lot about they do talk a lot about that. But, you know, to keep it real for a second, you know, this podcast I'm talking about isn't really it's pretty positive, but they do a lot of bitching, and they're pretty salty, you know what I mean? They're very vocal about that. They're very honest about that they do a lot of bitching, and they're pretty salty most of the time. So if you're somebody who's having, you know, that's having one of those days where you just want to, you know, do tons of bitching, and you're just salty as fuck, and you just need somebody to relate with on certain topics that you have strong feelings about, this is a really good podcast, because it's very relatable, and it's very just like, you know, it's very controversial. So don't be coming to this podcast if you're expecting, you know, cupcakes, rainbows, and unicorns, and all that. You know what I mean? This podcast is very controversial, and you know, they don't sugarcoat anything, like I previously said. Okay, so that was the 5 top witchy podcasts that I personally are my favorite, and I think you should definitely be listening to. And I have listened to a lot of podcasts in the past, but, you know, most podcasts I really don't like. I've listened to probably over 10 different pagan witchy podcasts, and these are the 5 that I have really found the most interest in. So yeah, but keep in mind, this was only an overview, a short overview on all the podcasts. There's still way more behind those podcasts I talk about that I probably didn't mention, that I probably forgot, because some of them have been going on for a very long period of time. So, you know, definitely if you want to learn more about those podcasts, then the best thing to do is to listen to those podcasts. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and you know, check out those podcasts, because they're really good, and podcasts are just really good to listen to if you just have nothing to do that day and you want something to listen to, or if you're driving to work, or if you're at the gym, or, you know, whenever you have any free time. You know, I always listen to podcasts whenever I have the free time. I always listen to podcasts, and most when I'm at the gym. So yeah, so hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and blessed be. Bye.